The dog sleeping at your feet right now. That creature is the product of one of the most consequential partnerships in the history of life on this planet. Tens of thousands of years of shared evolution, an alliance so ancient that dogs were traveling with humans across continents long before we planted the first seed, long before we built the first city, long before we wrote anything down. And we have absolutely no idea how it started. The origin and evolution of the domestic dog remains a controversial question for the scientific community, with basic aspects such as the place and date of origin and the number of times dogs were domesticated open to dispute. That sentence comes from a scientific paper, not from the 1970s, not from some fringe journal. It was published after decades of genetic research, after thousands of ancient bones were analyzed, after entire wolf genomes were sequenced and compared across 100,000 years of history. Locating the origin of dogs is made difficult by the lack of data on extinct Pleistocene wolves, the small morphological changes that occurred between wild and domestic populations during the first phases of domestication, and the lack of an accompanying human material culture at this time. Every tool we throw at this question seems to make the answer more complicated, not less. DNA studies contradict each other. Bones get misidentified. The wolf populations that gave rise to dogs are almost certainly extinct, which means we're trying to reconstruct a family tree using only distant cousins and old photographs. If you find that unsettling, good. It should be. This is one of the most important questions in the entire history of human civilization, and it remains genuinely, stubbornly open. If this kind of science makes you feel something, the mystery, the contradiction, the sheer strangeness of how little we know, subscribe and hit the bell. Every video on this channel is built around exactly that feeling.
For most of the 20th century, the story of dog domestication was clean, satisfying, and almost completely wrong. The version you probably learned goes something like this. Around 10 to 15,000 years ago, somewhere in the ancient Middle East or Central Asia, human hunter-gatherers were living in camps. Wolves, always watching, always hungry, began hanging around those camps, drawn by the scraps of food and the smell of fire. Over time, the bolder wolves ventured closer. The humans tolerated the less threatening ones. Generation by generation, wolves that didn't panic around people survived better. Their offspring inherited that slightly calmer disposition. And slowly, over centuries, a new creature emerged. Not quite wolf anymore, but not yet dog either. Something in between. Something that would eventually become the animal curled at your feet. It's a reasonable story. It fits the timeline of early human settlement. It matches the geographic evidence from the Fertile Crescent, where so many other domestications happened. And for a long time, it was the consensus. Then, genetics arrived, and everything got messy. Recent studies indicate that a genetic divergence occurred between the dog's ancestor and modern wolves between 20,000 and 40,000 years ago. However, this is the upper time limit for domestication because it represents the time of divergence and not the time of domestication. 20,000 to 40,000 years ago. Not 10,000, not 15,000. But potentially as far back as 40,000 years, which is 10,000 years before the oldest cave paintings in Europe, during a period when humans were still nomadic hunters sharing the landscape with mammoths and cave lions. The comfortable campfire story starts to strain at those dates. Hunter-gatherers 40,000 years ago didn't have permanent camps. They didn't have waste dumps large enough to sustain a population of wolves. They were moving constantly, tracking megafauna across a frozen landscape. Something was happening, much earlier, much stranger, and much harder to explain than anyone expected. Genetic studies suggest that all ancient and modern dogs share a common ancestry, descending from an ancient, now extinct wolf population, or closely related wolf populations, which was distinct from the modern wolf lineage. That's the other twist. The wolves that became dogs aren't the gray wolves padding through Yellowstone today. They were a separate population, one that has since vanished entirely. We can't study the ancestor directly. We can only reconstruct it from the descendants it left behind. Think about what that means for a moment. Every time a scientist tries to trace the DNA of modern dogs back to its wolf source, they're essentially looking for a ghost. The wolf population that started this whole thing is gone, and it's gone so thoroughly that even its closest living relatives, the gray wolves of today, are only distantly related to it, connected by millions of years of shared ancestry, but separated from the specific lineage that walked into human territory and never came back out. Studies indicate that an extinct late Pleistocene wolf is the nearest common ancestor to the dog, with modern wolves not being directly ancestral to it. For a long time, scientists assumed that dogs evolved from the modern gray wolf, but a study published in 2014 concluded that this was incorrect. That's a stunning reversal. For generations, dogs evolved from wolves meant wolves like the ones still living today. It turned out that wasn't the wolf at all. And if the ancestor is extinct, and the timing is uncertain, and the place is contested, then every piece of evidence we find becomes not an answer, but a new question about where the real answer might be hiding. So where did it happen? Three main camps have emerged in the scientific literature, each with real evidence, each with serious flaws, each defended by researchers who have spent careers digging through bones and DNA sequences. The arguments between them have gotten personal, methodological, and occasionally furious. The first hypothesis says East Asia, specifically southern China or Southeast Asia. This idea gained enormous traction in the early 2000s, largely from mitochondrial DNA studies. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited only from the mother, so it traces maternal lineages in a relatively clean way. When researchers analyzed mitochondrial sequences from hundreds of dogs and wolves across the world, they found the highest genetic diversity in East Asian dogs. And in evolution, higher diversity usually means older population. The place where something has been the longest tends to show the most genetic variation, simply because mutations have had more time to accumulate. Using whole genome sequences from a total of 58 canids, including 12 gray wolves and 27 primitive dogs from Asia and Africa, researchers found that dogs from southern East Asia have significantly higher genetic diversity compared to other populations, and are the most basal group relating to gray wolves, indicating an ancient origin of domestic dogs in southern East Asia around 30,000 years ago. That date would put domestication in the heart of the last ice age, before the glaciers reached their maximum extent, when the landscape of East Asia was cold, open steppe, and humans were hunting enormous animals across vast distances. It's a powerful argument, but it has a problem. Genetic diversity in a modern population doesn't only reflect ancient origins. It also reflects recent migration, interbreeding, and gene flow. If dogs from many different lineages converged on a region over thousands of years, which is exactly what trade and migration would produce, you'd see high diversity there too. regardless of whether that's where dogs originally came from. Critics pointed out that many studies contradicting the origin of dog domestication from China or elsewhere in Southeast Asia did not include wolf or dog samples from China or Southeast Asia. But that works both ways. Including those samples may inflate the appearance of diversity rather than reveal genuine ancestry. The second hypothesis points to the Middle East, or more broadly, Central Asia. The Central Asian origin hypothesis relies on nuclear genomic single nucleotide polymorphic analysis, which supports a Central Asian origin. It found that breeds of East Asian origin do not have the highest level of nuclear variability, and that most breeds share most haplotypes with Middle Eastern wolves. This is a different type of genetic analysis, looking at the nuclear genome rather than just mitochondrial DNA. And crucially, it produced a completely different answer. Same species, same question, different molecular tool, different continent. The Middle East argument also fits the archaeological record better, at least on the surface. What we have in Israel is really early evidence for a close relationship between dogs and people. Dog burials appear in the Fertile Crescent region tens of thousands of years ago. The oldest, unambiguous archaeological dogs are distributed across a wide arc from the Levant to Central Asia. This is also the zone where almost every other major domestication happened: goats, sheep, cattle, wheat, barley. A coincidence? Or a pattern? The third hypothesis takes a completely different approach and points to Europe. The oldest remains that can be unequivocally attributed to domestic dogs are found on the European continent, including an Upper Paleolithic jawbone from the Bonn-Oberkassel site in Germany, dating to approximately 14,200 years ago. Older specimens from Siberia and the Near East that have been proposed remain highly controversial. Europe also has something the other hypotheses struggle to explain: ancient mitochondrial DNA from early Holocene dog bones in Europe that looks distinctly different from the mitochondrial lineages in East Asian dogs. If dogs had spread out of East Asia, you'd expect to see East Asian mitochondrial signatures in early European dogs. You don't always. Sometimes you see something older, something that looks more like it was there already. While ancient mitochondrial DNA suggests a European center of dog domestication, analyses of mitochondrial and genomic data from modern dogs have suggested East Asia, the Middle East, and Central Asia. That single sentence contains the whole paradox. Mitochondrial DNA says Europe. Nuclear genomic data says East Asia or the Middle East. Ancient remains say something different depending on which bones you're looking at. Every methodology points somewhere different. And then someone proposed a fourth option. All three of them are right. A review of the archaeological record shows that early dogs appear in both the East and West more than 12,000 years ago, but in Central Asia no earlier than 8,000 years ago. Combined, these findings suggest that dogs were first domesticated from geographically separated wolf populations on opposite sides of the Eurasian continent. Dogs didn't have one origin. They had two, or possibly more. Two separate wolf populations on opposite ends of a continent independently crossed the threshold into domesticity. And then, at some point, the two lineages met and mixed, which is why the genetic signal looks so complicated everywhere.
The dual origin hypothesis is either brilliant or a way of saying we don't know, in a more sophisticated way. Its defenders argue it explains why no single region consistently shows the oldest dogs and the closest wolf relatives simultaneously. Its critics argue it requires too many convenient coincidences, two independent domestications, both successful, happening around the same time, in species that are notoriously difficult to integrate into human life. Maybe the reason there hasn't yet been a consensus about where dogs were domesticated is because everyone has been a little bit right, one researcher said.
And that is a strange thing to contemplate, that one of the longest scientific debates in evolutionary biology might resolve not in favor of one camp, but in favor of several of them simultaneously. The problem underneath all of this is DNA itself. Not as a concept, DNA is unquestionably the best tool we have for tracing evolutionary history. The problem is what happens when you try to extract and read it from ancient bones that have been sitting in the ground for 10,000, 20,000, 40,000 years. Ancient DNA degrades, it fragments, it gets contaminated by bacteria, by fungi, by the DNA of every organism that touched those bones in the millennia between burial and excavation. By the time researchers get to a sample, the original genetic material might be in millions of tiny pieces, none of them individually meaningful, all of them mixed with noise from a dozen other sources. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. Attempting to reconstruct the dog's lineage through the phylogenetic analysis of DNA sequences from modern dogs and wolves has given conflicting results for several reasons. It's not just that different labs get different answers from different samples. The same sample, analyzed by different research groups with different methods, can produce different conclusions.
Consider what happened when researchers began sequencing ancient dog genomes in the mid-2000s and early 2010s. A team at Oxford analyzed a 4,800-year-old dog from an Irish tomb. They generated genetic sequences from 59 ancient dogs and a complete genome of a late Neolithic dog from Ireland. Their analyses revealed a deep split separating modern East Asian and Western Eurasian dogs. That split was evidence for a dual origin, East and West, independent, both ancient. Then another team looked at ancient European dog samples from roughly the same time period and got a different picture. Contrary to the results of that previous analysis, they found that ancient dogs from the same time period were very similar to modern European dogs, including the majority of breed dogs people keep as pets today. Not two separate lineages meeting, one continuous European lineage stretching back into deep prehistory. Both teams used advanced genomic techniques. Both teams published in respected journals. Both teams are made up of serious scientists who know what they're doing. And they looked at overlapping evidence and drew conclusions that point in opposite directions. Part of the problem is something called ancient wolf gene flow. When a wolf mates with a dog, which still happens today and almost certainly happened throughout prehistory, it muddies the genetic record in ways that are extraordinarily difficult to untangle. Analysis of these sequences supports a demographic model in which dogs and wolves diverged through a dynamic process involving population bottlenecks in both lineages and post-divergence gene flow. In the domestication bottleneck, the founding dog population experienced at least a 16-fold reduction in effective population size compared to their wolf ancestors, a severity that exceeded previous estimates by a considerable margin, as documented in a 2014 study published in PLOS Genetics by a team led by researchers at the University of Chicago. A handful of animals from a handful of wolf packs, carrying only a sliver of the genetic diversity of their wild ancestors. Everything that came after, every breed, every lineage, every dog genome we study today, descended from that narrow genetic window. And then, wolves kept interbreeding with early dogs for thousands of years, layering wolf DNA back into the record, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish original dog ancestry from later wolf introductions. After their split, wolves and dogs clearly continued to interbreed, generating regional admixtures. For example, Iberian wolves are genetically closer to European dogs than to Asian dogs. But gene flow was seemingly all one way, from dog to wolf. Dogs were mixing back into wolf populations, not the other way around, which is strange, and which complicates every attempt to use wolf DNA as a clean reference point for where dogs originally came from. There's also the problem of the molecular clock, the tool scientists use to estimate when two lineages diverged, based on the rate at which mutations accumulate. The
The clock works on assumptions. It assumes a fairly stable mutation rate. It assumes the calibration points you're using to set the clock are accurate. And in ancient canid DNA, both of those assumptions have been challenged repeatedly. DNA analysis of an ancient wolf calibrated the split between dogs and wolves to 27,000 to 40,000 years ago. Researchers had previously calculated that the divergence happened about 11,000 to 16,000 years ago. That's not a minor adjustment.
That's a date range that effectively doubled.
The same molecular clock, recalibrated with better data, added tens of thousands of years to the timeline. And it means that every study that used the old calibration, many of them foundational papers in the field, may have dramatically underestimated when all of this began. As early as 11,000 years ago, there were already 5 distinct dog lineages, giving rise to canines in the Near East, Northern Europe, Siberia, New Guinea, and the Americas. Because dogs had already diversified so much by that time, domestication had to occur long before then. 5 lineages, already established, already separated across half the planet. 11,000 years ago was already ancient history for dogs. Which means the real origin, the moment a wolf first crossed into the human world and didn't go back, is pushed back further still, into a time so distant that the ice sheets of the last glacial maximum lie between us and the answer. And just when you think the story can't get more complex, consider what a 2025 morphometric study found when researchers analyzed 643 canid skulls spanning 50,000 years of prehistory. Extensive analysis of ancient and modern canid skulls shows that domestic dogs exhibited significant diversity in size and shape at least 11,000 years ago, well before modern selective breeding. The physical diversity was already there, already established, at the very moment our genetic record begins to give us a clear picture. The explosion of dog types happened in the dark, before the light of our genomic tools could reach it. Then came November 2025. A major study published in Science analyzed 73 ancient dog genomes spanning nearly 10,000 years, from East Asia to the Western Eurasian steppe.
The results indicate correlations between the ancestry of dogs and specific ancient human populations from Eastern Europe to Eastern Siberia, including ancient Paleo-Siberians, Eastern hunter-gatherers, East Asians, and steppe pastoralists. The researchers also identified multiple shifts in the ancestry of dogs that coincide with specific dispersals of hunter-gatherers, farmers, and pastoralists. Dogs didn't just follow humans. They tracked them genetically. When a human population moved, its dogs moved with it, and the genetic signature of both changed in parallel. Genomic analysis of ancient dogs and humans across Eurasia demonstrates that major human migrations and cultural changes over the past 11,000 years were closely accompanied by the movement of distinct dog populations. This co-dispersal, evident during events such as the early Bronze Age, highlights a long-standing, integral relationship between humans and their dogs. But that study couldn't tell us where the origin was. It told us that once dogs and humans were bonded, they stayed bonded, through migrations, through climate shifts, through the rise and fall of entire cultures. It showed us the middle and end of the story with extraordinary clarity. The beginning remains in shadow. And just 3 months later, in March 2026, researchers published findings in Nature that pushed back the earliest confirmed genetic evidence for dogs by more than 5,000 years. University of Oxford researchers identified dogs at archaeological sites dating to the late Upper Paleolithic, approximately 16,000 to 14,000 years ago. far earlier than the previous genetic record for dogs of around 10,900 years ago. These were real dogs, genetically confirmed, already spread across thousands of kilometers of European and Anatolian landscape. Professor Gregor Larsson of Oxford. By comparing the DNA from these ancient dogs with other ancient and modern populations, we were surprised to see just how closely related the earliest dogs were, despite living more than 4,000 kilometers apart. This suggests that the first dogs were a game changer and spread rapidly across Europe. The earliest known dogs were already widely distributed. They were already genetically established. They were already, in some fundamental sense, dogs, not proto-dogs, not wolves with a behavioral quirk, but genuine domestic animals living alongside hunter-gatherers at the edge of the last ice age. Which means the actual domestication event, the moment of first crossing, happened even earlier, before those dogs, before their parents, before the generations that gave rise to them. We keep pushing the date back. And every time we find the oldest dog, it turns out there was a dog before that one. There's something almost vertiginous about that pattern. Every discovery that should give us an answer reveals another layer of history hiding underneath it. The origin recedes as we approach it, like a horizon that keeps moving forward no matter how far you walk. The science isn't failing. If anything, it's succeeding too well, revealing the full complexity of something we assumed was simple. All of those genetic puzzles, all of those contradictory timelines, all of that ancient DNA pulled from bones dug out of permafrost, they describe what the DNA looks like after domestication was complete. They tell us the aftermath. What they can't easily tell us is the mechanism. How does a wolf become a dog? What actually changes? What's the biological process by which an apex predator transforms, over generations, into an animal that seeks out human company and reads human faces? For that question, we have an experiment. One of the strangest, most illuminating, and politically dangerous experiments in the history of biology. It started in 1959 in a Siberian city, inside a facility officially devoted to breeding fur animals, run by a geneticist who had already lost one job for believing in science too openly. The facility outside Novosibirsk didn't look like the site of a scientific revolution. It looked like what it officially was, a state fur farm. Long rows of wire cages stretching across the Siberian steppe, the smell of animal musk hanging in the frozen air. Workers in grey coats moving between the enclosures, feeding silver foxes that lunged at the cage walls when anyone came too close. These animals were not pets. They were product, valuable for their pelts, bred for coat quality, handled as little as possible, because handling made no difference to what mattered. The fur was what mattered. Dmitry Belyaev knew all of this. He had worked in animal breeding for years, and he understood the economics of the operation. But he was thinking about something else entirely. He was thinking about Darwin, about selection, about what would happen if you took a wild animal and selected it, generation after generation, for a single trait. Not coat color, not size, not litter yield, but behavior. Specifically, the willingness to tolerate a human being standing next to the cage without panicking. It sounds simple. It was, in a sense, the simplest possible experiment in evolutionary biology. But in the Soviet Union of 1959, it was also an act of considerable courage, bordering on recklessness. By 1959, the political climate had eased slightly under Khrushchev, but genetics was still sensitive. Studying behavioral inheritance, the idea that temperament could be selected for, that psychological traits
had a genetic basis, was exactly the kind of thing that could attract the wrong kind of attention. It touched on questions about human nature that Soviet ideology preferred to answer in a particular way. So Belyaev disguised the experiment.
Officially, it was a study in the physiology of fur animals. The selection criteria were recorded in administrative language that didn't reveal the real purpose. And in a facility full of researchers focused on coat quality, Belyaev began quietly selecting foxes by a different standard entirely. The criterion was straightforward. When a human experimenter approached a cage, how did the fox respond? Animals that attacked or fled in pure terror were not selected for breeding. Animals that showed some capacity to remain near a human without completely losing control of themselves, even if they were still clearly anxious, even if they were not friendly in any meaningful sense, those animals were selected. Not the calmest foxes, not the friendliest, just not the most frightened. The threshold was low, deliberately. Belyaev wasn't trying to create a pet. He was trying to understand a process. What happened next took less time than anyone thought possible. Within the first few generations, the selected foxes were already measurably different in their responses. Not dramatically different. They weren't rushing to be held or wagging anything. But the intensity of fear response had dropped. Animals that, in the wild population, would spend days recovering from human contact were stabilizing faster. They were watchful rather than panicked. There was something in the eyes of the selected animals that the control group, foxes bred without behavioral selection, simply didn't have. Belyaev was not surprised by behavioral change. That was the point of the experiment. What surprised him came later, in a way that he and his colleague Lyudmila Trut, who would go on to run the experiment for decades after his death, had not fully anticipated. The foxes started changing shape. In the fourth generation, researchers noticed something that had nothing to do with behavior. One of the selected foxes had a white patch on its forehead. This was not a known color variant of the silver fox population they were working with. It wasn't supposed to be there. It was noted, filed, and the animal was included in the breeding pool because its behavior qualified it. Then there were more patches. In the sixth generation, some animals had floppy ears that drooped down rather than standing erect, a characteristic seen in puppies and in domesticated animals, but not in adult wild foxes. In the eighth generation, some foxes had tails that curled upward rather than dropping straight. Their faces were changing subtly, the muzzle slightly shorter, the skull slightly rounder. Their hormonal profiles were shifting. Measurements of corticosteroid stress hormones, the chemicals that spike during a fear response, showed dramatically reduced levels in the selected animals compared to the control group. They were not just calmer in behavior, they were biochemically calmer. Their bodies were producing less stress. Lyudmila Trut, who documented this phase of the experiment with extraordinary precision, described the cumulative effect in a 1999 essay published in American Scientist. "We had not expected this," she wrote. "We selected for one thing, tameness, and we got a package." The domesticated foxes were not just tamer. They were physically, physiologically, and behaviorally different in a cluster of traits that had no obvious common genetic cause. This is what scientists now call domestication syndrome, and it's one of the most fascinating and still debated concepts in evolutionary biology. The syndrome appears in almost every animal that has been domesticated over a long period of time. Dogs, compared to wolves, have floppy ears more commonly. Pigs, compared to wild boars, have shorter snouts and curly tails. Domesticated sheep have smaller horns. Domesticated horses have reduced brain volume relative to their skull size. Cattle have depigmented patches, Rabbits, guinea pigs, cats all show overlapping clusters of the same changes when compared to their wild ancestors. The question Belyaev's experiment raised was, why? How does selecting for tameness, for reduced fear response to humans, produce floppy ears and spotted coats and curled tails? What does temperament have to do with pigmentation? What does stress hormone reduction have to do with the shape of a tail? One influential hypothesis involves a specific population of embryonic cells called neural crest cells. These cells migrate throughout the developing embryo during fetal development and contribute to an enormous range of structures. The adrenal glands, which produce stress hormones, pigment cells, which determine coat color, cartilage in the ears and face, and parts of the jaw. If selection for reduced fear response works by reducing the size or activity of the adrenal glands, which is exactly what the hormonal data from Belyaev's foxes suggested, then you would simultaneously be affecting neural crest cell populations that also contribute to ear cartilage, pigmentation, and facial structure. A single underlying change producing a whole suite of visible effects. Pull one thread in a sweater and watch 5 seams shift at once. You're not changing 5 things, you're changing one foundational thing that controls 5 things simultaneously. The domestication syndrome concept doesn't resolve every question, it raises new ones. How strong is the neural crest cell link exactly? Are all the traits in the syndrome genuinely connected through a single mechanism, or are some of them coincidental correlations? Researchers debate this actively. What Belyaev's foxes provided was something extraordinary, a real-time demonstration that domestication, at least in its behavioral and physiological dimensions, could happen fast. Very fast. Within 10 generations, the foxes were showing morphological changes that nobody had selected for.
By the time the experiment had run for 40 generations, the fully domesticated population was behaviorally indistinguishable, in many ways, from dogs. They sought eye contact. They initiated play. They read human social cues. They came when called. The experiment also dismantled a particular assumption about how evolution works. The assumption that significant morphological change requires enormous amounts of time. Belyaev's foxes compressed what seemed like it should take geological ages into something that could happen within a human lifetime. And this compression had a direct implication for the dog domestication debate. It meant that the physical transformation from wolf to dog didn't require hundreds of thousands of years. It could happen in thousands, maybe in less. Pick up a wolf skull and a dog skull and put them side by side. If you haven't done this, and most people haven't, the difference is immediately obvious. And then, the longer you look, the more interesting it becomes. The wolf skull is long. The muzzle is extended, powerful, designed to hold prey and tear through hide and bone. The teeth are large, the carnassials in particular, the paired shearing teeth that work like scissors, are massive relative to the jaw. The brain case is proportionally smaller. The whole structure communicates function. This is a hunting machine. The dog skull, even a large dog skull, even a breed that looks superficially wolf-like, is compressed. The muzzle is shorter. The teeth are crowded, often crooked, smaller. The brain case is proportionally larger. The stop, the angle between the muzzle and the forehead, is more pronounced. And many of these features, when you look at them carefully, resemble the skull of a juvenile wolf rather than an adult one. The proportions of a dog's face are, in many ways, frozen at a developmental stage that wolves pass through and leave behind. This is called neoteny, the retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. It shows up in behavior as well as anatomy. Dogs play throughout their adult lives in ways that wolves don't. They seek social bonding in ways that adult wolves, who have a rigid pack hierarchy,
are not built to maintain with members of other species. They are, in a fundamental sense, wolves that never fully grew up. And the selection process, whatever it was, wherever it happened, appears to have worked partly by slowing down or truncating normal developmental trajectories. The fossil record shows these changes, but it does so imperfectly and incompletely. The problem is that the transition zone, the period during which wolf-like animals were becoming dog-like animals, falls exactly in the range where fossil preservation is most difficult. The sediments of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, across most of the regions where domestication might have occurred, are either poorly represented in the archaeological record or contain bones so fragmentary that reliable morphological analysis is nearly impossible. What we do have is a series of specimens that look intermediate. Not quite wolf, not quite dog. A jaw from one site that's smaller than wolf, but not as reduced as later dogs. A tooth row from another site that shows crowding, the classic dog sign, but on a skull that's otherwise wolfish. The gradient exists in the bones, but pinning down the timing of the gradient is where the frustration sets in. One of the key findings from recent morphometric work analyzed skull shape across hundreds of ancient specimens and found something that should have been obvious, but wasn't. The transition from wolf-like to dog-like skull proportions was not gradual, in the way classical evolutionary theory would predict. There were periods of apparent stasis, followed by relatively rapid shifts. This fits exactly what Belyaev's experiment demonstrated, that when selection pressure is strong enough, change can be fast.
But it complicates the archaeological picture, because it means that the intermediate forms might have existed for only a short time and left very few remains. The period of rapid transition might be almost invisible in the fossil record, simply because it didn't last long enough to deposit many bones. The timeline compression problem cuts in two directions. On one hand, it means that domestication could have happened faster than we thought, which actually makes the extreme early dates from genetic studies more plausible, because if change was rapid, the initial domestication event could have been tens of thousands of years ago, with a subsequent rapid physical transformation producing recognizable dog morphology only much later, leaving us a misleading fossil record that seems to begin the story halfway through. On the other hand, rapid change means the window of opportunity to find transitional specimens is narrow, and our sampling of the fossil record in the relevant time periods and regions is still extraordinarily patchy. There is a direct line from Belyaev's wire cages in Novosibirsk to this paleontological puzzle. Because what his experiment showed was not just that domestication is possible. It showed that domestication, once started, has momentum. Once you begin selecting for the cluster of traits that reduce fear response in an animal, the physical changes follow whether you want them or not. The genetics of tameness and the genetics of morphology are linked in ways that evolution itself has built. Which means whoever or whatever started the wolf-to-dog transition, whether it was deliberate human action or an accidental ecological process, may not have needed to do very much to set the whole cascade in motion. And here, the story splits into two camps, each with a compelling argument and a different vision of how the first wolves crossed into human territory. The scavenger hypothesis has the advantage of elegance. It doesn't require ancient humans to make a decision. It doesn't require planning or intention or anything that we wouldn't expect from either party. It simply requires proximity and the oldest economic force in nature: free food. The version of this hypothesis, developed by researcher Raymond Coppinger in the 1990s and early 2000s, runs roughly as follows. As human populations began living in larger, more stable groups, and crucially, as they began generating significant amounts of food waste, the area around human camps became an ecological niche, a resource-rich zone that any opportunistic predator might exploit. Wolves, being intelligent and adaptable, began working the perimeter of these settlements, feeding on the garbage. Not because humans invited them, not because humans decided to domesticate them, but because the food was there. Under this model, the wolves that were best at scavenging near humans were the least fearful ones, those with lower fear response to human proximity. Those animals survived and reproduced better in this novel niche. Their offspring inherited the slightly reduced fear threshold. Generation by generation, without any human intent, a population of wolves self-selected for tameness by simply living near human settlements. The physical changes, the domestication syndrome, followed automatically, exactly as Belyaev's experiment demonstrated. Humans may not have actively domesticated dogs at all. The dogs effectively domesticated themselves, drawn in by the ecological magnet of human waste. It's a beautiful hypothesis, and it has real predictive power. If it's correct, you'd expect to see the earliest evidence of dog-like wolves in the archaeological record appearing specifically around sites of dense human occupation. Middens, campsites, anything that represents a consistent source of discarded food.
You'd expect dogs to appear later in history, not during the nomadic hunter-gatherer period, but after humans began living in larger sedentary groups. And you'd expect dogs to have originated in multiple places wherever these conditions developed, which would explain, the scavenger camp argues, the confusing multi-regional genetic signal. The active taming hypothesis says this is wrong in almost every particular. Its proponents point to several problems with the scavenger model. First, the timeline. If dogs required large, stable human settlements to self-domesticate, they couldn't have originated 40,000 years ago. The dense human camps that generate the necessary waste ecology don't show up in the archaeological record until the Natufian period of the Near East, around 15,000 years ago at the earliest. But the genetic data, and the newest genomic evidence, keeps pushing dog origins earlier. 30,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. At those dates, there were no garbage dumps. There were no villages. There were only small bands of nomadic hunters moving across a glacial landscape. Second, the behavioral evidence from wolves. Studies of modern wolves in various contexts show that the species is not generally prone to self-habituating to human presence. Wild wolves near human settlements do not gradually become tamer over generations in the way the scavenger model predicts. They remain wary as their survival demands. The leap from wild wolf to tolerated camp follower requires a behavioral threshold that the scavenger model struggles to explain without invoking something, some initial lowering of the fear barrier that didn't come from free food alone. Third, the fossil geography. The oldest confirmed dog remains are found not at large settlement sites with rich midden deposits, but in hunter-gatherer contexts.
The Bonn-Oberkassel dog from Germany, dating to approximately 14,200 years ago, was buried with its human companions in a double grave, alongside the body of an elderly man and a middle-aged woman. The dog had been ill before death and had been cared for during its illness. This is not the relationship of a scavenger tolerated at the edge of camp. This is the relationship of a companion animal, and it appears fully formed in the middle of the hunter-gatherer period, long before the conditions the scavenger model considers necessary. The active taming camp argues that humans with dogs had decisive advantages in hunting, in tracking, in alerting to danger that would have made the partnership worth maintaining through deliberate, if unsystematic, effort. Hunter-gatherers who kept wolves they had partially habituated were better at finding game. The wolves benefited from the food share. The relationship was mutualistic from the beginning, not one-sided exploitation of a garbage heap. Which hypothesis does the newest evidence support? The honest answer is
Neither cleanly. But the balance has shifted. Studies examining the timing of dog domestication have found that the origin event, whenever it occurred, happened during or before the peak of the last glacial maximum, a period so cold and so resource-limited that the stable, waste-producing settlements the scavenger model depends on simply didn't exist. A 2022 analysis combining genomic data with archaeological age estimates placed the origin of dogs at least 15,000 years ago, almost certainly earlier, in a context that looks more like nomadic hunters than settled villagers. And the Bonn Oberkassel dog, recently re-examined with ancient genomic data, turned out to belong to a lineage that was already fully genetically differentiated from wolves by the time it died.
That animal's ancestors had been domestic for a long time before it was born and buried with the people who cared for it. The relationship was not new. It was established. There is also growing evidence from the study of ancient dog genomes across Eurasia that dogs moved with human populations in ways that don't fit the scavenger model's prediction. Dogs didn't appear wherever there was waste. They appeared wherever specific human groups were. They tracked human migrations with a fidelity that suggests they were actively maintained, carried, fed, transported, rather than passively following an ecological gradient of available food. None of this fully settles the question. The scavenger hypothesis still has defenders who argue that the active taming model romanticizes the early relationship and underestimates the power of ecological drift. The debate continues at conferences, in print, in competing analyses of the same datasets. But the weight of recent evidence pushes towards something that looks more like intentional partnership than accidental cohabitation. The first wolves that became dogs were probably not scavengers tolerating humans from a distance. They were wolves that had been in close contact with specific human bands, carried, perhaps as cubs, fed deliberately, and selected over generations in a process that was not systematic in the modern sense, but was nonetheless directional. The question of where that first wolf came from, which population, on which continent, in which glacial valley, remains completely open. And now the genomic tools that were supposed to answer that question are generating a new problem entirely. Because the more ancient DNA scientists pull from older and older samples, the more the picture doesn't simplify. It branches. Not into 2 origin points or 3, but into a network of populations and migrations and hybridization events so complex that some researchers have begun asking whether the question, "Where were dogs first domesticated?" is even the right question to be asking. Whether the concept of a single origin, or even a double origin, is a human need for a clean story imposed on a biological reality that was always messier, always more fluid, always less resolved than we wanted it to be. The genomic findings of 2024 and 2025 didn't give us the answer. They revealed something both more unsettling and more fascinating, that the relationship between wolves and humans may have begun not as a single event, but as a process, geographically spread, temporally extended, interrupted and restarted, as messy and contingent as everything else in the history of life. And somewhere in the oldest layers of that process, in a period we can still barely see with any of our tools, something happened for the first time. A wolf didn't run. The fire is low. The night is cold in a way that has no modern equivalent. This is the cold of the Pleistocene, a cold that reaches into the marrow and stays there, a cold so complete that the stars above look sharp enough to cut. Around the fire, a small group of humans sleeps in a loose cluster. Someone is awake, feeding the embers. The smoke drifts sideways in the still air. At the edge of the light, not close enough to be seen clearly, but close enough that the warmth reaches it,
something stands and watches. Not the fire, the humans. It has been watching for a while now. It watched yesterday too, from further away, and the day before from further still. Each time the distance closed a little, not because anything pushed it forward, because nothing drove it back. The usual wire of fear that runs through every wild animal in proximity to something large and unpredictable. That wire, in this particular animal, runs at slightly lower voltage than in its siblings. Lower than its mother. Lower than anything in its bloodline that we can trace. It breathes. The air from its lungs makes a small cloud in the cold, and then it takes one step closer. That step, that single, unremarkable step, taken by an animal whose name we don't have, in a place we can't identify, in a year we can't calculate, is the hinge on which 15,000 years of human civilization quietly turns. Every dog that has ever lived descended from what happened next. Every sled team that crossed the Arctic, every search and rescue pair in the rubble of an earthquake, every puppy that has ever made a grieving person feel, just for a moment, slightly less alone. It all starts here, in the dark, with a wolf that didn't run. For most of the 20th century, the tools didn't exist to get much closer to that moment than the rough outline. Archaeology gave us bones. Morphology gave us skull measurements. Behavior gave us analogy. And from these imperfect instruments, researchers built competing stories that were all, in their way, plausible, and all, in their way, incomplete. Then came the genomic revolution, and for a decade or so, it felt like the answer was finally within reach. The early studies were intoxicating in their confidence. Mitochondrial DNA said East Asia. Nuclear DNA said Central Asia. Ancient genomes said Europe. Each new paper arrived with the implicit promise that this time, finally, the origin story was resolved. Each new paper was followed, usually within a few years, by a contradicting paper that resolved it differently. By 2021, the field was in a state of productive exhaustion. There were too many data sets, too many conflicting signals, too many hypotheses that each fit some of the data and none of the data simultaneously. A researcher working on ancient canid genomes at the time later described the feeling in an interview as trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle when you suspect someone has mixed in pieces from 3 different boxes. You keep finding combinations that almost work. Nothing clicks into a complete picture. The paper that changed the conversation arrived in Nature in June of 2022. A team led by researchers at the Francis Crick Institute in London, working with ancient DNA specialist Pontus Skoglund and his collaborators, sequenced and analyzed the genomes of 72 ancient dogs spanning 11,000 years of Eurasian prehistory. The geographic range was extraordinary. Samples from the British Isles, from Iberia, from the Pontic Caspian steppe, from Siberia, from the Levant. What they found was not a single origin point. It was a pattern. An ancient split, deep in prehistory, between dogs from Western Eurasia and dogs from Eastern Eurasia. A split that predated every major human migration, every cultural transformation of the Holocene, everything that happened after the ice retreated. And on top of that ancient divergence, layered over it like sediment, were wave after wave of subsequent mixing events. Eastern dogs moving west with steppe pastoralists, Western lineages replacing earlier populations, local dog populations going extinct and being replaced entirely by the animals that arrived with new groups of humans. The picture was not a tree. It was a braided river. Multiple sources constantly merging, splitting, merging again. And at the base of that river, older than everything else that could be cleanly sequenced, a divide that suggested the original domestication event, or events, happened before anyone expected. When this paper landed, the responses in the field ranged from excitement to visible frustration, depending on which prior hypothesis the researcher had been defending.
One researcher who had spent years building the case for a single Central Asian origin told a colleague, in a comment later quoted at a conference, that reading the paper felt like watching someone take apart a clock you've spent 10 years building and admit they don't know what time it is either. That's not a criticism of the paper. That's a description of the state of the field. And it's honest. The 2022 analysis didn't resolve the origin question. What it did was reframe it. The question, where were dogs first domesticated, was revealed to be, possibly, the wrong question, or at least not the only question. The more revealing question might be, how many times did the relationship between wolves and humans reach a threshold of no return? And what happened to those lineages afterward? Because if domestication happened more than once, if wolves in the West and wolves in the East both crossed into human territory independently, both established lasting populations, and those populations subsequently merged in a long period of Eurasian mixing, then looking for a single origin is like looking for the source of a river in a swamp. There isn't one. There are many trickles, and they all matter. Then came 2024. A team at the University of Copenhagen, analyzing a new set of ancient wolf genomes from across Eurasia, including specimens that had never been sequenced before, pulled from permafrost sites in Siberia and from cave deposits in the Caucasus, found something that nobody had specifically predicted. The ancient wolves closest in genomic composition to early dogs were not from any of the regions previously proposed as domestication sites. They were from a population that had ranged across a broad corridor between the Pontic steppe and southern Siberia, a region that was, during the last glacial maximum, one of the few areas of Eurasia with enough prey density to support both large wolf packs and mobile human hunting groups simultaneously. The Copenhagen team was careful in how they presented this. They did not claim to have found the origin. They published with explicit caveats about sampling gaps, ancient DNA degradation, and the uncertainty of molecular clock calibration. The lead author said, in an accompanying press statement, "We may have found where the dog's ancestors were. We have not found where domestication happened. Those are not the same thing." His colleagues in other labs received this distinction with varying degrees of patience. At a symposium in Vienna the following spring, one researcher, a veteran of the ancient DNA debates going back to the early 2000s, stood up after the Copenhagen team's presentation and said simply, "So we've been arguing about the wrong geography for 30 years. The room went quiet. Then someone said, "Possibly." And the argument resumed. This is what the frontier of this science looks like. Not triumphant announcements, not settled consensus. Careful, contested, iterative progress in a field where every new dataset arrives with new complications attached. Follow one of those researchers out of the symposium and into a quieter moment, and you find something that doesn't make it into the papers. A particular kind of intellectual vertigo that comes from working on a question that keeps refusing to close. A paleogeneticist sits at a workstation with two datasets open on separate screens. On the left, mitochondrial haplogroup distributions from modern dog populations, showing a clear signal that points east. On the right, nuclear genomic ancestry components from ancient specimens, showing a signal that points west. Both analyses were run on the same pipeline. Both used the best available reference panels. Both are methodologically sound. They point in opposite directions. This isn't a software error. This isn't a contaminated sample. This is the biology itself, carrying two different signals in two different parts of the genome. Each one real, each one reflecting something that actually happened.
The mitochondrial signal reflects the maternal lineage, the female wolves, who became the founding mothers of the domestic dog lineage. The nuclear signal reflects the combined ancestry of both parents across many generations. And if those two signals point in different directions, it means something specific. The female founders of the dog lineage came from one place, and the broader wolf population that contributed to early dogs came from somewhere else. Which can happen. Wolf populations are not hermetically sealed. Males disperse over enormous distances. A founding event in one region could involve females from a local wolf population mixing with males who had traveled hundreds of miles from a different stock. The genomic signal from the female line and the genomic signal from the rest of the genome would then genuinely diverge, pointing at different geographic sources that both contributed to the same founding event. It's a coherent explanation. It might even be correct. But it requires accepting that the origin wasn't a place, it was a process, spread across a geography. That the wolf who first stepped toward the fire was the daughter of one population and the granddaughter of another, and her descendants carried both signals forward into a history that science, 30,000 years later, is still trying to read. There's a particular kind of scientific honesty required to sit with that. To look at two contradictory datasets and resist the temptation to simply choose the one that fits your prior hypothesis, or to dismiss one as artifact. To hold both as real, and allow the contradiction to be genuinely unresolved. Some researchers find this maddening. Others, and this is perhaps a personality difference as much as a methodological one, find it clarifying.
Because a question that can't be cleanly answered with current tools is a question that tells you exactly where the next decade of work needs to go.
The data sets don't lie. They just describe something more complicated than the story we wanted to tell. And the job is to build tools complex enough to describe what actually happened, rather than forcing what happened into a story simple enough to tell cleanly. What has been established, beyond reasonable doubt, is this. The genetic divergence between dogs and wolves happened before 20,000 years ago, possibly before 40,000. Dogs were already widespread and genetically diverse by 11,000 years ago. The founding population was small, a bottleneck so severe that all dogs today carry the marks of it in their genomes, a tightness in the genetic variation that speaks to origin from a handful of animals. And those animals were already living in close enough association with humans that when humans moved, they moved. When human populations mixed, their dogs mixed. When a human culture vanished from the archaeological record, its dogs often vanished with it. The bond was total, from very early on. Whatever the origin, wherever, whenever, however many times, what emerged was not a loose ecological association. It was something so deep it rewired both species. Think about that last part. Both species. There's a version of the domestication story that's told entirely from one direction. Humans acting on wolves, shaping them, selecting them, transforming them. The wolf as raw material, the human as sculptor. And the evidence for this direction is overwhelming. Dogs are demonstrably a product of human influence. The physical changes, the behavioral changes, the extraordinary diversity of breeds produced by selective breeding over 10,000 years, all of it speaks to human agency operating on wolf biology. But something strange happens when you look at the other direction.
A researcher at Duke University named Brian Heir spent years studying a deceptively simple question. Why are dogs so good at reading human social cues? Wolves raised by humans from infancy, socialized with people from birth, are not nearly as good at it. Dogs that have had minimal human contact, street dogs, village dogs, still vastly outperform even the best socialized wolves on tasks that require reading human pointing gestures, following human gaze, understanding human communicative intent. This isn't a learned skill. It isn't primarily a result of exposure. It appears to be hardwired, a cognitive adaptation that evolved in the dog lineage during domestication, selecting specifically for the ability to interface with human minds. Dogs didn't just become tamer. They became, in a very specific cognitive sense, adapted to humans as their primary social environment. And then consider what humans gained. The relationship with dogs changes how humans behave in ways that go well below conscious decision-making. When a person looks into a dog's eyes and the dog looks back, both parties experience a measurable rise in oxytocin, the hormone associated with social bonding, trust, and attachment. This effect was documented by a team in Japan in 2015 and has been replicated in multiple contexts since. It's the same hormonal system that bonds parents to infants, that cements friendships, that underlies the deepest human relationships. Dogs trigger it in humans reliably and easily. And they have been doing this for at least 15,000 years, possibly much longer. Consider what that means for human social evolution. Humans with dogs were not just better hunters, they were different social animals. The presence of a dog in a human group changes group dynamics. It lowers aggression. It provides a focus for care and affection that doesn't carry the political weight of directing that care at another human. It creates shared purpose. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer societies in which dogs play a central role have noted that the dogs function as social glue in ways that are easy to overlook precisely because they're so constant. There is a hypothesis, not yet established, but taken seriously in the literature, that the cognitive demands of living with and communicating with dogs may have contributed to the selection pressure for expanded human social intelligence. That the tens of thousands of years of coevolution with an animal that needed to be trained, communicated with, managed, and understood may have been one of the forces that pushed human social cognition in directions it might not have gone otherwise. Not the only force, not the decisive force, but a force, operating continuously, at the level of daily life, for longer than agriculture has existed, longer than language as we know it may have existed. We shaped them, they shaped us. The arrow of influence ran in both directions, over tens of thousands of years, and the species that emerged on both ends of that relationship are not what they would have been without it. There's something almost vertiginous about thinking it through to its end. The dog didn't just adapt to the human world. The dog helped make the human world what it is. The first stone tools, the first controlled fire, the first cave paintings. We can list those as distinctly human achievements. The partnership with dogs is different. It's an achievement of two species simultaneously, neither of whom planned it, neither of whom could have foreseen where it led. Stand back far enough from the whole story, and something strange comes into focus. We began with a question. Where did dogs come from? We've spent a century throwing increasingly powerful tools at it. Morphology, mitochondrial DNA, nuclear genomics, ancient bone sequencing, molecular clock calibration, morphometric analysis of hundreds of skulls spanning 50 millennia.
And the question has not resolved. It has deepened. Every layer we strip away reveals another layer beneath it, older and more complicated. This could be read as failure. It isn't. What the study of dog domestication has actually produced is something more valuable than a simple answer. It's produced a precise map of our own ignorance, a detailed, carefully drawn diagram of exactly what we don't know and why. We know that the origin happened before 20,000 years ago. We know the founding population was small. We know the domestication syndrome is real and that it happened fast. We know that dogs tracked human migrations with extraordinary fidelity for at least 11,000 years. We know that two species are now so deeply intertwined that separating their evolutionary histories is analytically impossible, because they don't have separate evolutionary histories. They have one shared history, written in two genomes simultaneously. The remaining mystery, the where and the when and the how many times, is not a gap in the science. It's a frontier. And the tools that will close that frontier don't fully exist yet. Better ancient DNA extraction from degraded samples, larger reference panels of ancient wolves from the critical time periods, improved molecular clock calibration using independent archaeological anchors, computational models complex enough to simulate the braided river pattern of ancestry that the 2022 Nature paper revealed. Those tools are being built. The researchers building them are working on a question that has frustrated and fascinated their predecessors for generations. And they know it. And most of them seem to find that energizing rather than defeating. Because this is what science actually looks like, most of the time, at its frontier. Not a smooth accumulation of confirmed facts, but a genuine wrestling match with a reality that keeps turning out to be more complex than the best available theory.
And meanwhile, the partnership itself continues, unbroken, undimmed, operating at 15,000 years of momentum and showing no signs of stopping. The dog sleeping at your feet right now is the descendant of that wolf at the edge of the firelight. It carries in its genome the marks of a bottleneck that happened before the pyramids were dreamed of, before the first wheat was planted, before anything we call civilization existed. It carries the cognitive adaptations that allow it to read your face and understand, with a sophistication no other non-human species approaches, what you mean when you point at something, what it means when you leave the room, what it means when you come back. It looks at you the way it looks at you because something, somewhere, at some point in the deep past, looked at a fire and didn't turn away. And the humans around that fire didn't drive it off. They let it stay. Whether that was an accident of ecology or an act of deliberate kindness, whether it happened once or twice or in a dozen places across a frozen continent, the outcome was the same. Two lineages tangled together in the dark, pulling each other forward into a future neither of them could have reached alone. We haven't found the exact moment yet. We keep looking, and every year the tools get sharper, and every year the picture gets a little more complete and a little more complex at the same time. The answer is in there somewhere, in the ancient permafrost, in the degraded DNA of bones nobody has found yet, in the mathematical models that haven't been written yet. And the animal next to you, breathing slowly, is the living proof that whatever happened, it worked. If this kind of question does something to you, if the intersection of deep time, genomic science, and the animal sleeping at your side hits you the way it hits me, subscribe and share this with someone who has a dog. Because they deserve to know just how strange and old and unresolved the story they're living with actually is.